Every story of man begins with a choice, and the first choice that shaped history wasn't made in a courtroom or a council, but in a field between two brothers. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. Genesis 4:8. When Cain's hand struck his brother, it wasn't just a murder. It was the first fracture of mankind, the first spilling of innocent blood. And once it hit the ground, the earth itself cried out. And he said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." Genesis 4:10. You see, God didn't curse Cain for anger. He cursed him for silence. Cain never confessed, never repented. He turned away, and that turning, that exile, became the mark. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. Genesis 4:11-12. Cain said, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." But mercy, even then, covered judgment. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Genesis 4:15. That mark, it wasn't a symbol of favor. It was a warning, a divine boundary, God's way of saying, "You may live, but not among my presence." It's the first moment God allows rebellion to breathe, so that history could show what happens when man builds without him. Cain's descendants would go on to build the first cities, forge the first metals, shape the first music, and raise the first altars to false gods. From Cain came builders of Babel, the dreamers of empire, and the architects of pride. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Genesis 4:17. But here's the thing. Even exile has a purpose, because God was not done writing the story of blood. The earth would remember Abel's cry, and through that memory, he would raise another seed. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, says she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain has slew. Genesis 4:25. This right here, this is the first prophecy of division. Two seeds, two paths, one to rule through force and one to serve through faith. The book of Jasher tells us that Cain wandered far from Eden through the lands of Nod, where he built his line and found wives among those who fell from obedience. They became the masters of craft, the inventors of vanity, and the fathers of corruption. And Nadab bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. And he was the father of all such as handle harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Genesis 4:20-22. They were brilliant, but brilliance without truth becomes blindness. And in that blindness, the mark of Cain became more than a curse. It became a legacy. The mark still walks among men. It's not on their skin, it's in their heart. It's the mark of rebellion, of self-made kingdoms, of towers that reach for heaven but have no foundation in God. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Psalms 127:1. So when you see the world today, with its nations, empires, inventions, and idols, remember this: it all started with one man, one choice, and one mark. But the story doesn't end there, because when God marks rebellion, he also marks redemption. And that redemption began with the seed of Seth, the line that would carry light through the darkness and restore what Cain had lost. And that's where we're headed next. Then man began to call upon the name of the Lord. Genesis 4:26. When Cain left the presence of the Lord, he walked into a land the Bible calls Nod, a word that means wandering. But Cain wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was building something the world would never forget. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Genesis 4:16-17. Now this city wasn't a home. It was a statement, a wall between man and God. The first place on earth built without permission. While Adam tilled the ground in repentance, Cain carved in stone in pride. He built the city for protection, but what he was really building was the world system we live in today, a system of walls and wealth, of kings and commerce, of power built on fear. Cain's city was the blueprint for Babylon. Woe to him that buildeth the town with blood and established a city by iniquity. Habakkuk 2:12. The book of Jasher tells us that Cain's descendants began to multiply quickly and fill the land with creation, but not with obedience. Ada's sons became the first herdsmen and traders, men who learned to own, to sell, to profit. Zillah's sons forged metal, brass, and iron, and the first tools, the first weapons. And Jubal made music. And Nadab bare Jubal. He was the father of all such as dwell in tents and such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handled the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Genesis 4:20-22. They called it progress, but in heaven it was a rebellion wearing a crown. You see, every invention carries an intention. Metal to farm became metal to kill. Strings to worship became strings to entertain. And the city that once promised safety became a fortress for sin. And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. I have slain a man of my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Genesis 4:23. The blood of Cain had ripened into violence. Lamech, Cain's descendant, killed again and sang about it. That was the first song of rebellion, the first song sung without sorrow. And from that day on, the world learned how to celebrate sin. The land of Nod grew rich, its towers shining with brass and gold, but its people were hollow. They built faster than they prayed, and they sang louder than they listened. And God watched. You see, the city of Nod wasn't destroyed, it was scattered. And every civilization that followed, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, the nations of today, still carry its blueprint. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Psalms 127:1. So next time you walk through a city full of lights and towers, remember where it started. That's not progress you're seeing. That's Cain's curse in modern form. Man still wandering, still building, still searching for what he lost in Eden. But while Cain built his walls, God was preparing another line, not one made of stone, but of spirit. The sons of Seth were watching from above, and soon the heavens themselves would move. Every story of rebellion starts with a whisper, and sometimes that whisper echoes in heaven before it's ever heard on earth. The Bible tells us that men began to multiply. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were fair. And that's when heaven came down. And it came to pass, when man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Genesis 6:1-2. Now these weren't ordinary men. They were called watchers, angels appointed to guide, to observe, to protect. But it was written in the book of Enoch that they grew up restless, watching the children of men from afar. And on Mount Hermon 200 of them swore an oath together and descended. And they called the mountain Hermon, because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. 1 Enoch 6:6. They came shining like fire in the night, but when they touched the ground, their light dimmed. Each one took a wife from among the daughters of men, and from those unions came the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty ones of old, men of renown, but not of righteousness. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Genesis 6:4. They taught mankind what heaven had hidden. Azazel taught the making of weapons and armor. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabil, the knowledge of the stars. And Penemu, the art of writing. And they taught them charms and enchantments in the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare giants, whose height was 3,000 ells. 1 Enoch 7:1-2. These angels, once radiant guardians of truth, became the first false gods. Their names became Zeus, Odin, Quetzalcoatl, and Ra. Their children became the demigods of legend. And every mythology the world teaches today is just a memory of the rebellion that started here. The world calls it mythology. The Bible calls it sin. And all the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Genesis 6:11. The book of Jubilees says that when the watchers fell, they mingled their blood not only with man, but with beast. And every creature, every bird, every animal, every fish became corrupted with them. The world itself began to cry out, and the earth made accusation against the lawless ones. 1 Enoch 7:6. That's when God spoke to the archangels, and his voice thundered through the heavens. And the Lord said unto Michael, Go, bind Semjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women. And to Gabriel he said, Go, against the bastards and the reprobates and the children of fornication. Destroy the children of the watchers from among men. 1 Enoch 10:11-13. Judgment was coming, but not yet, because even in wrath, God leaves a window for mercy. And before the flood would wash the world clean, he would send one man, one family, to carry the uncorrupted blood forward. That man's name was Noah. And though the world was fallen into darkness, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:8. You see, the fall of the watchers wasn't just rebellion. It was infiltration. It was the merging of heaven's power with hell's pride, and it almost worked. But God's covenant stands, and his plan always has a remnant. The word says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and the world changed forever. But the truth of that verse goes deeper than most preachers dare go. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Genesis 6:1-2. These weren't simple men chasing beauty. They were watchers, angels who had fallen, taking flesh and teaching corruption. And the daughters they took were of Cain's line. The book of Lamech of Cain tells us something few know today, that the line of Cain was beautiful to the eye, but poison at the root. Their women, skilled in adornment and art, became the first to beautify themselves, paint their faces, braid gold into their hair, and charm the eyes of heaven itself. And they adorned themselves with all manner of precious stones, and the sons of God looked upon them and desired them. 1 Enoch 8:1. It was temptation perfected, and heaven failed for it. The angels descended, the daughters of men accepted, and their children were no longer fully human. And they bare giants whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. 1 Enoch 7:3-5. These hybrids, the Nephilim, became legends. Every ancient culture calls them gods, titans, or heroes. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. They were the children of disobedience, and their blood would echo through history. Now here's where the story takes a turn, because God sent the flood to destroy that bloodline, to wash away the corruption. But corruption always finds a way back. And through one woman, it did. Her name was Naamah. You won't hear her name in most pulpits, but she's there, written between the lines. She was the daughter of Lamech of Cain, and she became the wife of Noah. And Noah took unto himself a wife, and her name was Naamah, the daughter of Lamech, and she was fair and wise and upright in all her ways before the Lord. The book of Lamech of Cain. She wasn't wicked, she was chosen, but her blood carried a memory. Through her, the seed of Cain survived the flood, the trace of the watcher's DNA, sleeping, waiting, until it found a vessel to awaken again. And Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis 10:8-9. That phrase, he began to be, isn't about reputation. It's transformation. Something in him changed. The blood of giants rekindled after the flood. Through Naamah came Ham, and through Ham came Nimrod, the first post-flood Nephilim. Japheth's sons were made large and strong. Shem's sons were keepers of righteousness, but Ham's line carried the sleeping curse. From Ham came the builders of Babel, the giants of Canaan, the Anakim and the Rephaim. From that line came the very enemies Israel would one day face in battle. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Numbers 13:33. You see, the flood didn't end corruption. It only slowed it down. The real war, the war for the bloodline, is just beginning. From this moment on, every covenant, every nation, every battle in the Bible is about blood, who carries it and who keeps it pure. It's not race, it's lineage. It's the war between heaven's breath and rebellion's seed. And yet, even in that, God's mercy remained. Because through Shem, through the faithful line, the promise still stood. The seed of redemption would still come, and his blood would become incorruptible. The watchers fell. The daughters of men were deceived, but the plan of the Almighty never changed. And that's the truth of the LittleSeason. No matter how many times the world rewrites history, the blood of truth still speaks. By this time, the earth was no longer the world Adam had walked. The breath that once carried life now carried decay, and what God made in his image was being remade into something else's. The book of Enoch tells us the offspring of the watchers and the daughters of men were called the Nephilim. Their strength was unmatched, their appetites unquenchable, and their size unnatural. And they bare giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. 1 Enoch 7:3-5. The earth cried out beneath their feet, and the trees broke under their weight, and the rivers ran red. They devoured everything, animals, crops, even men. They ruled through terror, and their people began to worship them as gods. Enoch records that they taught men war, women enchantment, and children corruption, and their power spread faster than fire. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. 1 Enoch 8:2. The book of Jasher adds that these giants began to mingle with the beasts of the earth. They experimented, mixing creatures, man with beast, bird with reptile, and fish with serpent. They reshaped life in their image, and the world became something else entirely. And they taught the mixture of animals of one species with another, in order therewith to provoke the Lord. Jasher 4:18. The flood wasn't just judgment for sin, it was quarantine for creation. God had to cleanse what was infected. The land that once flowed with harmony became a wasteland of hybrid monsters, lions with wings, serpents with limbs, and giants who ruled as kings. And their names are carved on every ancient stone the world still bows to. Egypt called them gods, Greece called them titans, Mesopotamia called them Anunnaki. But the truth is, they were all the same, fallen blood, descendants of the Watchers. Now the school books call these things myth. They draw them as fiction, teach them as fantasy, but the scriptures record them as fact. And the earth itself, the ruins, the bones, the legends, all bear witness. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Genesis 6:4. And that phrase, and also after that, is the key to understanding the world we live in now. Because after the flood, that same bloodline rose again. Through Ham came the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Zamzummim, tribes of giants that Israel would later face in battle and destroy. And through their cities, Bashan, Hebron, and Gath, we still find their stones standing, too large to move, too perfect to be chance. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it. Deuteronomy 3:11. So when we talk about the Nephilim, we're not talking about fantasy. We're talking about ancestry, the bloodlines that shaped empires, built kingdoms, and taught mankind the art of war. And if you follow those bloodlines long enough, they lead straight to the kings and dynasties we still revere today. Because power remembers its origin, and corruption always seeks a throne. The Nephilim failed once, but their legacy, their arrogance, never stopped trying to climb back up. From Babel to Rome, from Babylon to Washington, the world keeps building towers. But one day, just like before, God will say again, enough. It wasn't just the people that cried out, it was the earth itself. Every hill, every tree, and every river. They remembered Eden. They remembered peace, and they mourned. And all the earth made accusations against the lawless ones. 1 Enoch 7:6. The book of Jubilees tells us that the earth labored under the weight of blood. It couldn't breathe. It couldn't rest. Because man had forgotten his purpose, to guard the garden, and instead he consumed it. And they began to devour one another, and to drink the blood, and to eat the flesh of men. 1 Enoch 7:4. Enoch says the heavens shook, and the angels who remained faithful began to plead with the Most High. They saw what had become of the world they had once guarded. And then Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel looked down from heaven and saw much blood being shed upon the earth, and said one to another, The earth made without inhabitant cries, the voice of their crying until the gates of heaven. 1 Enoch 9:1-2. And the angels cried out, The Lord of eternity, you see what they do, how they have corrupted the earth and taught all flesh unrighteousness. And for the first time since creation, heaven wept. The Spirit of the Lord moved once again upon the face of the waters, but this time not to create, to cleanse. The ancient text says that when the Lord declares judgment, the stars themselves dimmed, and the seas grew restless, even the firmament trembled. And the windows of heaven shall be opened, and the fountains of the great deep shall be broken up. Genesis 7:11. But before the storm came the whisper. God spoke to a man, a righteous man, blameless in his generation. And that word generation meant something then. It meant bloodline, pure, uncorrupted blood. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was just a man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Genesis 6:8-9. Noah wasn't perfect in behavior. He was perfect in blood, the last of Adam's pure line, a descendant of Seth, unmingled by the fallen seed. He was the last man standing in a world that had forgotten what it meant to breathe truth. And God told him, Make thee an ark of gopher wood. The word ark, it means container of covenant. It wasn't just a boat. It was a vessel of preservation, a womb for the world. Because before God destroys, He always preserves. Before He floods, He calls. Before He ends, He begins again. The book of Jasher says that Noah began building and the people mocked him. They said, Old man, what are you building in the dry land? And he answered, I build because judgment is coming, and I will not be found asleep when it arrives. And friends, that's the same call today, the same warning echoing through time. Because just like then, the earth is crying again. You've heard me say it before. Everything that happens down here has its shadow in heaven. Man's story is heaven's echo. When we act, heaven responds. When we rebel, heaven records. The ancients understood this. They saw that the fall of angels in the heights and the fall of men on the plains were two sides of one broken mirror. And when the mirror shatters, both heaven and earth grieve. The scriptures say that the earth was filled with violence, and all flesh had corrupted its way. But violence on earth was only half the sound. Above, heaven thundered with the pain of betrayal. As in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. Luke 17:26. That verse tells you something. Heaven and earth move in rhythm. The same corruption that once filled the world is risen again, and the same mercy that once built an ark is calling now. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Room shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without pitch. Genesis 6:14. This was more than a blueprint. It was a covenant in wood and tar, a reflection of heaven's promise made visible. Every board laid by Noah's hand echoed a command spoken from the throne, and every hammer strike was a heartbeat of obedience. The book of Jasher tells us the people laughed. They called him mad, building a vessel for rain that had never come. But heaven had already seen the flood before Noah ever saw a cloud. And the Lord said unto Noah, Enter thou and all thy in thy house unto the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Genesis 7:1. When heaven looks for righteousness, it doesn't look for crowds, it looks for covenant. And Noah carried that covenant like a flame through the world of wind. His obedience on earth was the key to unlocking heaven's mercy. Now remember this pattern, because it'll repeat. Whenever man's corruption reaches upward, heaven's correction comes downward. That's not wrath, that's alignment. Heaven restoring what earth forgot. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and his female. Genesis 7:2. The sevens weren't random, they were rhythm. The same rhythm that built creation. 6 days of labor, 1 of rest. 6,000 years of striving, 1 of peace. God writes in patterns, not in paragraphs. And while the flood washed away corruption, it also washed the calendar, reset the world clock, and the first great reset wasn't digital, it was divine. Everything after the flood became year 1 all over again. So when we study these timelines, Adam to Noah, Noah to Abraham, we're not counting numbers, we're counting echoes. In each age is heaven answering earth. Each covenant is God rebuilding his reflection. And that's what the ark really was, a mirror turned upright again, a sign that even when the world falls apart, heaven still remembers its design. You see, before the flood ever came, the world wasn't just corrupt, it was convulsing. Men had built kingdoms, giants had built empires, and both believed they could outrun what heaven had written. The Book of Giants, one of the fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, tells us something you won't hear in Sunday school. That the giants, the sons of the fallen angels, began to dream of their own destruction. They saw visions of a great flood coming, and they begged Enoch, the righteous one, to plead for them. And they said to Enoch, "Go, declare to the watchers of heaven who have left the high heaven and defiled themselves with women, that they may obtain forgiveness." Book of Giants, Fragment 2. But heaven's answer wasn't silence. There would be no pardon, and the judgment was already sealed. Enoch, he didn't just write prophecy. He ruled the world in peace for 243 years. Jubilees tells us that the kings and tribes brought him gifts, and that the sons of God sought his counsel. He was the bridge between heaven and earth, a living sign of what man could be before the fall took him too. He was taken from among the children of men, and we conducted him into the Garden of Eden in majesty and honor. Jubilees 4:23. But after Enoch was taken, the light of the world dimmed. The watchers no longer feared the Most High. Their sons grew wild, hungry, angry, unrestrained. The book of Jasher says that the giants began devouring the flesh of men, and blood filled the rivers. And they sinned against birds and beasts and creeping things and the fish, and devoured one another's flesh and drank the blood. Jasher 4:18. And when the cry of the earth reached heaven, the judgment trumpet sounded. The watchers were bound, their sons were marked for destruction, and the countdown began. The people saw Noah building his ark and mocked him still. But the book of Lamech Cain says their leaders, the kings of the giants, gathered their armies, and they tried to break the gates of heaven. They tried to save themselves. They said to one another, "Come, let us make war with the righteous and with heaven itself." Book of Lamech Cain, Fragment 5. But there was no saving what had already died inside. The sons of Seth, who were once like the watchers, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Cain's children. Heaven and earth reflected each other again. two armies, both fallen, both blind. That's why Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. He wasn't talking about weather. He was talking about alignment, corruption in high places and low, in spirit and in flesh. The world before the flood was the mirror of our world today. So as the ark's doors closed, the giant screamed, the mountains shook, and the skies turned red, and heaven wept, not in anger, but in mercy, because sometimes mercy don't come to spare us. It comes to start over. Now before judgment ever fell, heaven gave the world a warning, not once, not twice, but 3 times, because the Most High don't move without mercy first. The book of Enoch tells us that God spoke through his servant and said to the watchers, "You have defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and you shall have no peace." But that wasn't the end. It was a start of patience. Enoch ruled the world in peace for nearly 243 years. Kings bowed to him and giants listened to him, and for a season the world grew still again. The book of Jasher says that under Enoch's reign the hearts of men turned from violence and back to righteousness. The giants ceased from devouring flesh, and the earth rested. For 500 years the mercy of God stretched over a world that didn't deserve it. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24. When Enoch was taken, the light went with him, and that peace began to fade like smoke after a sacrifice. Then came Lamech and Methuselah, 2 men who still feared God. The book of Enoch and the book of Lamech of Cain tell us that they warned that the giants and their fathers, the fallen angels, that the end was appointed. 500 years are given unto you. Repent, for the flood shall come, and the earth trembled at their words. For a short while the world quieted again. Even the giants held their breath. But like waves after a storm, sin rose again. The watchers whispered to their sons. They said, "Surely the Most High forgets. Surely we are too strong to drown." And so they built cities higher, walls thicker, and altars deeper. Every act of pride was a stone in their own grave. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. Genesis 6:3. That was the second warning, 120 years of grace. Noah stood before them like a preacher on dry land, hammer in hand, calling to repent. And some did, for a moment. They helped him build. They listened when he prayed. But when the sky stayed blue and the river stayed calm, they walked away laughing. Because that's how mercy works, friend. It looks like madness right up until the rain begins. The ark stood ready, a monument to patience. Every beam was a sermon, and every nail was a warning. And yet the whole world kept living like time itself couldn't end. Then the day came, the last of the 120 years. Methuselah, whose very name means when he dies it shall come, breathed his last breath, and heaven exhaled judgment. The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Genesis 7:11. Friend, that's the power of mercy. It waits as long as heaven can wait. 500 years through Enoch's reign, 120 more through Noah's warning. Every nail, every prophecy, every pause was love holding back judgment. The flood didn't come without notice. It came with every sunrise they ignored, every sermon they mocked, and every prayer they laughed. The flood wasn't just water. It was consequence. So when the first raindrop fell, it wasn't surprise, it was silence. because the heaven had already spoken. The time of warning had passed, and the time of cleansing had come. And the Lord shut him in, Genesis 7:16. Next time, family, we'll step inside the ark. We'll hear the silence of the world outside and the heartbeat of a new creation inside. Because in every flood, there's a future. In every storm, there's still a Savior. This has been The History of Us, Episode 2. I am your host, The Rev, and this has been Truth Unfiltered. Thank you for coming. God bless you. Take care. Until next time.